fundamentally different, at best superficially similar, but only in the Christian faith. Only in the Christian faith. No other worldview. I dare you to think about this. Only in the Christian faith is forgiveness offered as a gift of grace and not something that is earned. Every other worldview, you earn your salvation. You ask a Muslim, how do you get to paradise? Your good deeds have to outweigh your bad deeds. You ask a Hindu, how do you get to moksha or nirvana? And his or her answer will be that you have to pay the karmic law and the karmic cycle. Christ offers you forgiveness by taking the judgment of sin upon him and giving you the grace and mercy. That's why the fascinating part of the prodigal son story is not so much that he returned, but that the father left the home to run out and meet him and receiving back and tell him, this my son was lost and is now found. All truth is exclusive. The question is, are you able to defend that exclusivity with grace and love?
From self-referencing judgment, I determine what is good. I decide what is good. Am I willing to give that prerogative to my neighbor too? Am I willing to give that prerogative to the person who stands in front of a television camera and lops off another person's head, supposedly doing good? How do we arrive at an objective standard if I am only going to do it apart from a transcendent objective worldview? So that's an immediate problem, but there's a greater problem than that. This is true only of the Christian faith, Kerry, and if the listener is hearing me, I want to say this very clearly. In every other worldview, you find a way of being good and find a way of not being bad. But in the Christian message, the reality is this: Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live.
Yes.
That's the reality. It is not that we will be good and therefore we will see God. It is the fact that I cannot ultimately attain salvation by lifting myself up by my own ethical bootstraps. Every other worldview is good versus bad. If you ask a Hindu, for example, he'll say my karma. If you ask a Muslim, my good deeds have to outweigh my bad deeds. You come to the message of Jesus Christ, and it is grace and mercy and forgiveness. That's why even in the Old Testament, you don't get the 10 Commandments until you first get redemption. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, therefore you shall have no other gods before me. Redemption always precedes righteousness, and then redemption and righteousness precede worship. That's the wrathful God of the Old Testament over against the benevolent and the gracious God of the New. It's a false dichotomy. If you really look at the Old Testament, you have to first see what it is that was being accomplished there. The moral law was given to a people with a dynamic attendance of the supernatural and the miraculous. If you go through the Exodus, punctuated miracles. The time of creation, the time of Moses, the time of the prophets like Elijah and Elisha. You move on to the time of John the Baptist and the early church. Those are the classic periods of miracles. And when the dramatic disclosure of God was attended by such incontrovertible evidence, like food coming from the heavens to take care of you every day, a double portion coming before the Sabbath, when the waters are gettered, when the bitterness is taken away, when the dead are raised like Lazarus and so on in the New Testament, in proportion to the nature of the dramatic miracle was the rightful expectation of compliance and obedience. Because if you don't obey in the face of such a dramatic revelation, you will never obey no matter what happens. That's the first thing I want you to know. Second thing is that God was building a covenant people through whom he was going to disclose himself. But in that covenant relationship, you hear such extraordinary statements. You see, for example, in Isaiah, I think the parable of the vineyard there, where he says, what more could I have done for you that I have not already done? Wherefore, when you're looking for grapes, when I'm looking for grapes, why do you bring forth wild grapes? When you look at the book of Hosea, it is the most magnificent exposition of the love of God. How do we know that? Because here's a prophet by the name of Hosea who marries a woman by the name of Gomer who turns out to be a prostitute. Imagine being Hosea and looking for your wife in the heart of the city, and you see a lineup of men who are standing outside the brothel to buy her for an hour's pleasure. And Hosea stands in line to buy his wife back for a day's rations and half the price of a slave of that time. He brings his wife back. Imagine that feeling of the one you have loved becoming a harlot. And yet what does God say to him? I command you to go and love that woman, beloved of her adulterers. It's the ultimate expression of grace. So when you say it's a hard concept of law and judgment, no. We are missing the proportion of the revelation and miracle that God is expecting a response to it. And we are missing the fact that he loved them so much. And in the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, it begins by saying, I have loved you. And yet you say, in what way have you loved us? The love of God is the central feature of the Old and the New Testament.